Welcome back to Northwest Elite Spirit. I'm Coach Brian, and this is my personal journal on my last video, Assuming Responsibility, from Journey to Ixtlan by Carlos Castaneda. And from the beginning of this excerpt, Carlos is accusing Don Juan of doing something to him. Even though he came to Don Juan and keeps coming back to Don Juan and asking him to show him about plants, Carlos still isn't listening to Don Juan about what must be learned in order to talk about plants, and he's asking Don Juan, "What are you doing to me?" Carlos says, and Don Juan says, "You came to me. I'm not doing anything. You asked me to teach you about plants." And Carlos says to Don Juan that what Don Juan has showed him so far has nothing to do with plants, as if Carlos would know, what it takes to learn about plants from Don Juan. And I've actually ran into this experience a lot when I was running an MMA gym and I was teaching MMA and boxing, or even fitness. Students would come in supposedly to learn and then start telling me what's what about boxing, mixed martial arts, and fitness. And so I relate to this a little bit, but also from the teacher side and from the person who doesn't get it side, and we can get into that a little later. Don Juan tells Carlos to think of his death now, and so Carlos is starting to get in his head a little bit, and Don Juan's really good at reading what's going on in your head, probably because you make certain mannerisms or breathing patterns or facial expressions. So Don Juan tells Carlos to think of your death now. And he goes into that death is the ultimate, and every other thing happening in your life pales in comparison. And this has been working for me lately when I get stressed out and I start to think about my death and that I have no time for a bad mood or crappy thoughts, as Don Juan says. And even in dealing with, or even in doing my last video, I had an issue where I got a phone call that got in my head a little bit, and so it momentarily put me in a funk and got me frustrated. Then I started thinking of my death, and it stopped my crappy mood. And how can I have time for that? When death is the hunter, it would divert my energy from what I'm needing to do to resolve that issue and other tasks at hand. So he says to Carlos that he knew Carlos was lying. So Carlos asks Don Juan what he did to him when he first met. And he says that he knew that Carlos was lying, and maybe by the fact that he could sense some remorse. Again, like we make faces and we make certain body postures and we have certain tones when we're communicating. And I think Carlos, or Don Juan, is very good at picking up on those things. He could sense that Carlos had some remorse for the things he was saying. And Don Juan is schooling Carlos that even then he should have been fully committed to the task. So even though Carlos was lying, he should have gone forth with that with full commitment, no remorse, and no sense of, feeling bad about the situation. And then so Carlos starts to feel remorse for promising himself that he wouldn't become annoyed or angry with Don Juan. And he begins to blame his frustration with himself on his father. And we'll get into that a little bit. He feels bad for making promises he can't keep to himself by going into a story about how his father couldn't keep promises to himself about going swimming every day at 6 a.m. His father would come around during the summers and visit him on his grandparents' farm, and he would say, "We're going to get up at 6 a.m. every day and we're going to go swimming," and it would never happen. And he says his father couldn't keep his promise to himself. It would frustrate him that his father couldn't keep his promise to himself about going swimming every morning at 6 a.m., and therefore his father was weak. And Carlos is really getting angry and frustrated right now and raising his voice. So he's basically admitting to himself that he was weak because he made promises to himself that he wouldn't become angry or frustrated with Don Juan while Carlos was back in his home in LA. And so I think that's what really angers him. He's feigning anger at his father when he's really angry at himself. And I've dealt with this in my life with my sons. My oldest thought, for instance, like that my daughter and I had given up on archery, and he came to our house one day and was surprised to see that we had an archery range set up, and we practiced regularly. And it seemed to be a great surprise to him that we were doing that. And he had expressed that maybe I hadn't fulfilled some of the things in life that I said I would. And right now, my sons may see me as a man who's promised a certain way of living, and they're upset to see me not living up to it. And I'll go into this a little bit. The issue, though, is that even though I've produced the things I said I would, they were unable to see it because they had already decided that I never had and maybe never would. And so even when I presented these things to them to share with them, they rejected it or they just couldn't see it. I don't have anger over this. It's just an observation about how we can blind ourselves by telling ourselves a story out of anger or frustration that may not be true or may have been remedied, and yet we're blind to it, and we can't undo the world we have pictured for ourselves or that we claim has been presented to us. And again, going back to my MMA and coaching days, I had a student who was spending a lot of time with her children at the time, but in the past she hadn't, and she was expressing frustration that now that she was spending all this time with her kids, her oldest was constantly saying that mom never spends time with us. And I think, and this was my advice to her at the time, I think it was a storyline that she couldn't get over from the past. It was like a story set in her head, even though everything in front of her eyes was showing that it wasn't true anymore. And I know many adults who are stuck in childhood that way. There's things that in their lives have changed, even in themselves, that they refuse to see, and in others, maybe their siblings or their parents, that they refuse to see. And so again, if I think of my death, I wouldn't want to die frustrated or in a crappy mood towards someone around me. Let's say I'm on my deathbed and somebody shows up who I've told myself a story about that frustrates me. I think I'd have to let that go. I wouldn't want to die like that, and I wouldn't want to die. I wouldn't want them to have that in their mind, me dying frustrated with them or angry with them or sad with them or anything like that. I think when I think of death, I can see more clearly and I can let a lot of those things go. So Don Juan basically asked Carlos, he asked him, so if you were so worried, why didn't you go swimming yourself? And I think the question really is, if you were committed to it, if you were truly committed to it because you're so worried about it, why didn't you do it yourself? And this is something I'm practicing lately, and I can go into something I recently did. I practiced it for the 200-mile trek I just finished. The company I was going to do this through, it was a race, may have been setting my race credits over to next year, but I was committed to doing it this year. So instead of waiting to find out if it was going to be held over or postponed or whatever, I just decided right then and there when I read the email that I was going to do it myself without them. I wasn't going to wait to see what was going to happen. And I think that's the way it should be. Because if I didn't run this 200 miles, it would have been nobody's fault but my own. I could have been mad at them. I could have been mad at the race director or the volunteer coordinators or whoever. But this way, I handled it all by myself. Well, not all by myself. I got help from my daughter and a friend as far as food and meeting me at certain places. But I decided to do it myself, and so I didn't let anything get in the way. And so Carlos expresses that he's always been sucked into other people's schemes. That's why Carlos is saying the reason he doesn't like people making like such claims that things have to be this way for life to proceed. He says that he doesn't like to be, he's always been sucked into other people's schemes. So other people have always said things are this way, and he's gone along, and it's not turned out good for him. And that goes into my personal feelings in the past of being hooked to other people's schemes. That was a complaint of mine for a long while. I'd hook myself to someone else's dream, even though I knew for a long time the saying that you may share in the labor of another man's dream, but you will not share in the fortune. And yet I persisted in hitching myself to other men's dreams. And the outcomes of that was not their fault. Me being left in the dirt, or me not getting what I thought I would get out of it, or what I thought I needed out of it, was nobody else's fault but my own. I'm fully responsible for the schemes I hooked myself to, and for the people I hooked myself to. And again, Carlos asks Don Juan, why are you doing this to me? Still not facing the fact that his life is his own and nobody is doing anything to him. And Don Juan answers that perhaps he is engaging with Carlos like this because Carlos was brought to him. And that since Don Juan has nothing pending, and that Don Juan is hooked to nothing, he can have a proper gesture with him. And I think what he means is that he can have a heartfelt, fully committed, shared experience with Carlos because he has nothing else in the way. I take it to mean that since there is nothing holding Don Juan back or getting in his way, Don Juan can share a real experience with Carlos from the heart, a real heartfelt experience. So that's what I have on this one so far. I don't know if that is kind of scattered or what, but next will be the other half of this excerpt, and I'll share my thoughts after that. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Coach Brian with Northwest Elite Spirit. Subscribe, like, comment, share, and of course practice. For access to my suggested library, my blog, my shop, and my elite performance coaching packages, go to northwestelitespirit.com, and you can find Northwest Elite Spirit on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. Thank you.